On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, we continue our series on Advent and Christmas with a look at some misconceptions and myths about Christmas and how Chesterton can help settle those for us. Again, viewers and listeners, welcome to another episode of Uncommon Sense. I'm Joe Grabowski, the VP for Evangelization here at the Chesterton Society, and joined as always by my wonderful co-host, Grettelyn Darkey. Hi, Grettelyn.
Hi there, Joe.
And as I mentioned in the intro, we're continuing on with our series of Advent special podcasts. If you're not familiar, you can go back in the archives, either on the podcast app where you're tuning in or on YouTube, and check out those so far in the series. Here we are in the second week of Advent, and I thought kind of for a different approach this time, what we would look at is maybe some misconceptions or myths that get trotted out inevitably every year at this time, part of the, let's say, war on Christmas. Things like that it has pagan origins and, that it's just a warmed over version of a pagan feast or something like that. So I thought we could help maybe dispel some of these myths and bring peace back to our observance of this season. Any initial thoughts from you, Grettelyn, as we get started and talk about this?
Yeah, I just think that it is funny that this is sort of a perpetual theme, I don't know. It's like a pick your favorite fight for both for atheists and even for some of our friends who don't seem to really understand where this feast day actually comes from. So it is important, I think, to talk about this and help people understand this as much as we can.
Indeed, yeah. And, one of the inspirations for this particular episode for me was that I was listening to a popular podcaster. I won't name names, but this individual was saying that really this kind of debate, this claim of Christmas being of pagan origin has largely gone away. Everybody in the know knows the truth of this matter. And I thought, well, that may be true online for very online Christians or Catholics. There is a host of resources out there. A little bit of Googling or research on this topic will point you the right way. However, unfortunately, I don't think that everybody is so tuned in. And I remember, last year around this time being out at a pub and it was decorated for Christmas and this gentleman from Ireland was in and, just naturally started talking about this with his friend, kind of sagely saying, oh, well, this is where Christmas really comes from. It wasn't, And so I thought maybe we could start there because that anecdote it took an interesting turn for me, and I just want to kind of preempt our conversation or right up front, get this point out of the way. I engaged with this gentleman and started talking to him and said, well, I don't think you're right about those claims that you're making. And we started chatting, but it became apparent to me very soon that he didn't believe in the historicity of Jesus Christ as a figure. He didn't trust. And that's kind of an even more outlandish and less attested theory. There are some scholars who will still try to, sententiously hold that Christmas has pagan origins and whatnot, but almost nobody with any scholarly credentials actually doubts the historicity of Jesus Christ as a figure. This guy did, and that was kind of interesting to me, and so the first caution that I'll make up front is that, when people feed on a diet of misinformation and myths, chances are they're pretty thoroughgoing in that diet, and they have more than you would think, and so don't allow it to become a distraction. So in other words, maybe somebody at a work party or something will bring up some of these things, but I would suggest maybe probing a little further because there's probably more urgent needs and questions that could be answered than just defending the church's customs around Christmas, right? This guy needed the kerygma. This guy needed to be told just about Jesus and the reliability of the fact that there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth who in fact was more than a man, but he needed those basics. And so, yeah, always be careful about that, because sometimes I feel like we get into these arguments and there's a much bigger point that goes unaddressed if we allow ourselves to chase all of the loose threads that are hanging out there.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the forest for the trees, for sure. Reminds me a little bit of when the unfortunate scandals came out, with the Catholic Church. I had some friends, some family members who just pointed straight to them and said, well, this is why I've left. This is it. And I knew, and they knew, that wasn't really the reason. Like there's so much more going on there. And you're never gonna convert somebody by just engaging them on the sort of outlier points. So, but we're gonna engage in these outlier points just to give you some things to say that maybe can get you to those deeper moments where you can help somebody really get in touch with what they need to get in touch with, which is the love of Jesus Christ, as our friend Chesterton always was trying to do. Really.
That's right. Yes, it all points ultimately back to the everlasting man. To this God in the cave, whom Chesterton writes so eloquently about, and that's kind of why any of this is important for us. So yeah, let's jump into it, and we do have an argument from Chesterton that I'm going to kind of hold off. We're going to trot that out at the end because I think it's sort of the capstone argument that we want to make about this. So we'll save that for later. So make sure you listen all the way to the end to get some vintage Chesterton and a really good point that he has to make. But let's just start with kind of this notion of the history of Christmas that it originated in a pagan feast. So you will hear this sometimes, and the two major feasts that are claimed, although one of them was not a major feast by any stretch, even in the Roman calendar, but the two feasts that are claimed to be the origins of Christmas are Saturnalia and the Sol Invictus. And I think we can dispel with these pretty quickly. For those that want to claim this, the best way to approach this, in my opinion, is to really probe the evidence. To ask them, well, what evidence do you have that would make the case that this is based upon, or that Christmas is based upon either of these things? And I think what you'll find is that they don't have an answer to that question. They don't have any evidence. It's simply circumstantial. And, there's something telling about this that, look, there's only 365 days in the year, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whereas, Christians and of course the Jewish people only have one God, the Romans were spoiled for them, right? They had tons of gods. They had a whole panoply of gods. And so it was a pretty crowded calendar when you think about it. Like, in other words, if you're the early Christian church and you're setting a date to mark some sort of festival or custom, it's just sort of odds on that you're going to land on a date that the pagans are doing something with, right? Yeah, anything you want to say about this particular one? I think this is the big one that we hear this time of year. You hear it on the History Channel and other places.
Yeah, and it's funny how it's sort of just usually just mentioned offhand as though it was known by everybody, without any evidence. So I think it is a very astute point to try to probe for evidence on this. It also seems to me kind of silly that you would even pick on any certain date, because really, like you said, the Romans particularly were spoiled for choices. They had crazy festivals all year long practically. So like, why particularly Saturnalia? It kind of fits, but like not really. So it I don't know. It doesn't even seem like the particularly maybe the best feast to pick. I don't know. It just seems, the more you think about it, the more you talk about it, it doesn't particularly work very well.
Yes, indeed. And it's a winter festival, right? So Saturnalia took place in December. It did not take place on December 25th. It took place from the 17th to the 23rd, I think. It was basically a week-long festival. And the Romans had that, but I'm willing to bet, I haven't done deep research on this, but probably every pagan people in the northern latitudes probably had a similar festival.
Mm.
And this is one of the things that, we'll get to that Chesterton points out. There's a famous passage, I believe, in the New Jerusalem, where he's talking about, anybody speaking of the child born in winter would mean by it what we mean by it. In other words, that it's just natural at this time of year, especially, again, in the climates of the Northern Hemisphere, where it's getting dark, it's getting cold, there's no light in the world, that you're going to have some kind of feast, some kind of celebration to ward off that darkness, to ward off that gloominess, to do things like hanging greens in the home and maybe lighting candles or burning things to bring some light where there's darkness. And so, we shouldn't be surprised that there's something going on in the pagan world. It's a huge leap from there to say that Christmas is just based on this, right? Again, it's a coincidence. It's bound to happen. Had the Christians just, been at liberty to arbitrarily pick another date and made the birth of Christ, say in February or in May, they would have been competing with other festivals that took place around those times. So, again, without evidence, you can't make this, and it really is sort of a huge, glaring. It's not even an argument from silence; it's an argument of assumption that says, "Oh well, there was a pagan feast happening, and the Christians tried to co-opt it by having, the celebration of the birth of their Lord right around the same time." Yeah, the same could be said for the Sol Invictus, right? So, the Sol Invictus was, supposedly this feast. It was a very minor feast. The historical record is less sure of this than it was even on Saturnalia. We don't even know, for example, that the Sol Invictus was even really being celebrated before Christmas. It might, in fact, be the opposite case. It might be that the pagans saw that the Christians were celebrating their deity at this time of year, and in a last gasp to try to compete, they threw a feast day in there of their own. So, so don't believe what you read or hear on the History Channel or hear on the news or hear from Joe Rogan. These are myths that are out there. They're popular misconceptions, but the bottom line is it's a coincidental calendar occasion, as anyone would expect who knows anything about sort of ancient Rome and their pantheon of gods. And the Christians had separate reasons for thinking that this happened on December 25th. So maybe we could talk about that, where and why the winter celebration of Christmas comes in. But anything else you want to add at this juncture, Grettelyn?
No, I think that's I didn't know about the Sol Invictus potentially being after the Christmas initiation of the Christmas celebrations. I think that's interesting and a good refutation and just a good example of the sort of mental leap that it takes to just dismiss. Again, it seems more like an attempt to explain away rather than to actually explain where Christmas comes from, which is what we are going to try to do. So let's go for it.
Yeah, indeed. And whether or not it is after, again, the point is that it's we always have to remember in making these sort of apologetics cases that the burden of proof is on the person who's trying to claim something novel, right? So you can't just spout something off. We don't have to undertake the burden of defense for our point of view. If there's no evidence to show that there's an actual causal connection, not mere correlation, but causal connection, that the Christians, came up with this in order to try to co-opt some pagan feast, then I would say that the argument has already failed. It hasn't been made. So once again, where we can go next is to say, well, here's what you have to overcome. We know, we know where some of the traditions informing the dating of Christmas come from. So you'll hear about this this notion of the complete life and things like that. There's a bit of dubiousness about this, but one of the arguments is that a prophet had this. It was sort of a numerological idea that it was a perfection of life to be born or conceived and die on the same day.
Mm.
And there was an early tradition that the date of Good Friday, the calendar date of Good Friday, was March 25th. And of course, that became the date on which was celebrated the conception of Christ, right? The Feast of the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel comes to Mary and announces that she's going to have this child. And so, if you know a little bit about the birds and the bees, conception comes first. It's a simple matter of math. From March 25th, add 9 months. Guess where you land?
Mm-hmm.
December 25th. So it really seems to be just that the dating of the incarnation, whether or not that was based upon, the notion of the complete prophetic life, that numerological theory, the dating of the incarnation as March 25th is definitely the primary source for the inference that, it was in December, and probably December 25th, that our Lord was born. And once again, the naysayers will have all their reputations prepared. They'll have arguments. For example, my favorite is that sheep wouldn't be out in the fields. The shepherds are described as, being out with their sheep. And my favorite response to this is Jimmy Akin's response. And he says, have you ever noticed what sheep wear? Right? They're wearing wool. That's what we wear when it's cold outside. Well, sheep have it. Sheep have wool, and it keeps them warm.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the purpose for it. And so this is just one of those things that, once again, it gets kind of trotted out as a gotcha argument. And what people may not know is that there are still shepherds, in the Middle East, and they still do pasture their flocks at this time of year. So,
I mean, there are sheep in Pennsylvania, where we both live, who
right.
basically live almost outside right now. It's snowing, so yeah, it's that's a funny. And I've never actually heard that argument. I think that's kind of funny.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's out there. You'll hear it.
Yeah, that's very funny. I think it's also important to remember that, probably the church was marking this day in some way from the very beginning. I think it's kind of silly to think that they wouldn't mark the birth of the person who's the most important person in the whole faith, right? And the entire early church, the apostles, all had access to Mary, to the Blessed Virgin Mary. So presumably she did know when her son was born as well. So that's not irrefutable evidence, but if you believe in the apostolic tradition and you think that there's any way that the church was marking this day at all, they potentially got the date from his mother. So again, not irrefutable, but a good logical argument, I think, for where we may have gotten this from, assuming that this date was marked very early on, which again, it's hard to determine that, but seems like a little weird that they wouldn't mark it, as it is the most important date in all of history if you are a Christian.
Indeed. And we can kind of stick upon that a little bit and make another point that's sort of related, is that to be clear, this isn't a de fide sort of thing. The dating of Christmas, when it falls, it's important to recognize that December 25th was sort of calculated as the time of the winter solstice in ancient reckoning. And so whether or not it actually does have the historical connection, which is, as we pointed out, there's a decent case to be made that it is, but we're a liturgical people, right? The Jews were a liturgical people, and so Christians, in a similar way, what was less important, say, for the Jews was it wasn't important that they were marking Passover, let's say, on the historical anniversary of the actual Passover in Egypt. What was more important was that they were kind of revisiting that memory of the people and celebrating it and reenacting it in a sort of theatrical way. And so Christians adopt this very same thing. And so, whether it's Easter that you're talking about or whether it's Christmas, the dating isn't the primary thing. It's the liturgical renewal of the mysteries that we're kind of called to enter into imaginatively and through pageantry and through celebration. And in that connection, it just makes sense. It makes sense that it would happen on the day of the year when it's as dark as it's going to get, and then the light begins to grow. Mm-hmm. The light has come into the world, right? A light has shone in the darkness, and the darkness has not comprehended it, right? So there's a fittingness to the dating, regardless of whether or not it's a historical fact.
Yeah, and kind of on that note, I think it's important to remind people who trot this out as some kind of definitive evidence that, I don't know, Christmas isn't real or something, that it actually doesn't matter very much, right? It doesn't really matter, even if Christmas was completely adopted from some pagan feast. If Christ is real, it really doesn't matter how we celebrate or how we adopted that celebration. It just doesn't matter. So it's not actually an argument for anything, which is, I think, important to remember if the worst comes to worst in the pub with the Irishman or wherever you happen to be.
Indeed. And, it is a shame. It's especially a shame when I think Christians themselves will argue about this or argue about such things. I remember a very heated disagreement once when I was in seminary between two individuals who, one of them was very, very offended at the notion that Christ was born in a cave, right? He said it was probably like a barn. It was an above ground structure. Where are you getting this from? And I'm sure he was informed by, what he had seen in manger scenes or creches that had been set up. Once again, do we know? No, I don't think we do. We know a little bit about sort of ancient architecture and the way things were constructed in Bethlehem, and very possibly it was kind of a amalgam of both. It might have been sort of a structure built onto a cave. There's a lot of different theories or research that has been done to try to explain what kind of place this was. So, for example, one of the ideas is that the way houses were built back then, they would make use of natural shelter, or if you didn't have to put up four walls and you had a natural structure as part of that wall, so much the better. But also, animals and such would very frequently be stabled in a room of the house. It wasn't sort of a whole separate out in the fields kind of place where you kept the animals. You could take better care of them by having them kind of right there on hand. You didn't have to walk out in the freezing cold to take them their food and slop out the place. And also, you benefited from their warmth, right? It was kind of preserved within the home. So, so there is one theory, for example, that says, or one bit of scholarship that would say that when they say that there's no room at the inn, that and this could be inferable from the Greek word being used, it just means kind of like the main part of the house, right? Yeah. The main part of the house is full, and so Jesus is born where Mary and Joseph are staying, which is out with the animals in kind of the anteroom. So my only point in going into that, first of all, is that it's interesting trivia knowledge if you want to kind of bring it up and chat with your friends. But more than that, again, if that upsets you, I think we always need to kind of inventory and say, like, well, what? None of that takes away from what the story is and what the story tells us and what we actually know. Sometimes we get very, very attached to our images of these things, and that can be its own form of distraction, especially again when it leads to kind of petty arguments, as the one that I witnessed about, no, it wasn't a cave, it was you know,
Yeah.
some kind of Amish barn out in the fields. Like, it's just not the kind of thing to get upset over.
Pretty sure the Amish were after the Christian era. No, that's very true. And it's funny. You may have heard that detachment is considered a virtue in the Catholic life. That can seem like a funny thing, but it does come out of Scripture. Anyone who doesn't hate his mother, father, children cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And of course, Jesus doesn't mean hate in the sense of hate, but he does mean that you must be detached even from things that you are most close to. So it is important we should even be detached from the 25th of December, right? If something comes forward to prove definitively that Jesus was born on May 7th or something, we need to be able to just be like, okay, that's fine. So it's this ability to just kind of not roll with the punches, because you don't just necessarily accept everything, right? But this ability to say that there's more important things that we should be focusing on. We don't need to nitpick so much necessarily to be able to celebrate this great feast properly.
Indeed, yeah, and that's sort of our main kind of bottom line. I know that in the last episode, if you've been following along with this series, we talked to our colleague Tyler Blansky, and I made the point there of the other misconception about sort of the Magi. The Magi showing up the night of Jesus' birth, right? And this just doesn't seem to be the case from all the evidence that we have. We seem to it seems to be a bit more certain that the Magi came later, well after the birth. But again, we're very attached to kind of our major scenes and our celebrations, and we like to think that all these events were contemporaneous, but it doesn't need to be, and it's not going to impact your celebration of the season. We will have some extra resources. I'll try to put these in the show notes for people, though, just so that the more you want to know, the more you want to dig into this, the more say that you want to come up with the best plausible defense for the December 25th date. There's a lot of just great scholarship and great research that has been done on this, right down to, for example, the dating or what we can surmise or infer rather from Zechariah doing his service as a priest at the temple and when he was doing that, and then the coincidence of Mary going to visit Elizabeth. Basically, we have this idea that given the relative ages of John and Jesus, that the Zechariah story and his coming from having been in the temple sets kind of another calendar date for reference that we can look at, which would then put the birth of Christ in mid to late December, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot out there, and I guess the bottom line, though, is not to let any of this stuff steal your peace as you go through the season. And I think this is maybe a good time, Grettelyn, to bring in our patron of joyful man that he was. He can help us retain some joy. But this essay, we'll link to this in the show notes. This is a 2-part essay from late December, early January. It kind of went over the holidays. It was released in GK's Weekly in 1935-36. So that transition. And it's just called The History of Christmas. And Grettelyn, we were talking before the show. You said this is the first time that you had read this one. So any initial thoughts or?
Oh, it's so great, Chesterton. I mean, it's such a beautiful piece of reading him and being like, I've read all this before, but it's just put in the service of something else in a beautiful way. It reminded me of his talking about the flood and how that's explained away and how silly that is, and just his whole he has such a mind that goes, there's such a thread that runs through his mind that the continuity is really astounding. And I think this little essay, if you read a decent amount of Chesterton, you could pick these up and really see as you said, it's a later essay, so you could really see the projection of his thought through this essay, and it's a little bit of a climax of this idea. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and not to kind of spoil it for the readers, but the main point that he's making here is kind of what I would call like intellectual jiu-jitsu, right? He's using the strength of the opponent against the opponent. In other words, he allows all that he can allow, and then proves that this argument doesn't have a sting. And so he basically says, it may be the case that Saturnalia was basically stolen and baptized by the Christians to celebrate the birth of Christ. Again, as you pointed out earlier, the birth of Christ is a fact. That happened. How and when we celebrate it is a less important thing. And so he says, it may be that the Saturnalia, just as the Saturnalia was made for a society of slaves, but it gave one wild holiday to those slaves, the medieval Christmas had to exist in a feudal society, but all its carols and legends told again and again a story in which angels spoke to shepherds and a devil inspired a king. The ancient revolt is enshrined in an ancient ritual. The reason why Christianity found it easy to absorb these pagan customs is that they were in this way almost Christian customs. And this is classic Chesterton. It is, as you point out, a thread, but not just through this essay, through his whole life. He always had this very, very warm sympathy for the right kind of paganism, or the right impulses of paganism. You see this in The Everlasting Man. You see this elsewhere throughout his writings, where Chesterton makes the point that there's something wholesome in some of these old customs, and one of them would be this idea of the winter feast, right? That we want that. So he says, it may be the greatest glory of the Christian tradition that it has incorporated so many pagan traditions. So again, takes the argument and turns it inside out, turns it on its head, and says that, far from, if it were to be proven to be the case, that, this is what the Christians did with this stuff, whether it's, decorating with holly or laurel or mistletoe, or the very fact of celebrating this when we celebrate it. Even if we allow all that, and we can allow all that, far from being an embarrassment, it's actually something we should wear proudly on our sleeves.
Yeah, and I love how he points out that Christianity only suppressed the pagan rites and rituals that should have been suppressed, like killing people. Just this idea that if it wasn't a bad thing, why bother to suppress it? There was a lot of absorption because some of it was a good impulse, as you said. And he says that, the ancient pagans seem to have more sense than the modern pagans and more human impulses. One of which is, trying to brighten this gloomy time of year by some kind of feast or festival, to remember that, it's not going to last forever. We're going to get through this. Hopefully eating your grandparents isn't part of the ritual or anything like that. But that's the sort of part that would have been suppressed by Christianity, right? So it's this idea that you can take what's good and you can baptize it. And we'll talk about this more, I think, in a later episode when we reference one of Frances Chesterton's plays about her sort of baptism of the pagan gods and how they could have, maybe kind of morphed into the saints, not literally, but this idea that there are things, and again, like in The Everlasting Man, there are things that are good, that are useful, that are human in the sense of the word, as in, God made us and he gave us good impulses that can be brought in without totally invalidating the Christian thing, and B, polluting it in some way.
Yes, indeed. And so we highly recommend this. Just to read you another little excerpt here to whet your appetite. He says that there's, of course, he loves paradoxes. He loves combining two things. And he says there's two mysterious truths in the human and heathen conception of the winter feast. The first is that what was then heathen was still human. It was both mystical and material. It expressed itself in sacred substances and sacramental acts. It understood the mystery of trees and waters and the holy flame. And the other fact is that while a thing is heathen, it is not yet completely human. And so he says, basically we take all that is human out of it. If indeed this theory is correct, we take the human side of it. The fact that the winter feast, he says, I love this. There's a perfectly natural parallel between a religion that defies the world and a ritual that defies the weather. Mm-hmm. And so once again, when everything else maybe in our arsenal, we don't have the facts at hand. We can't remember, let's say, the case to be made that December 25th was the date, or that Saturnalia was not the origin. Chesterton gives us, if we can remember this perspective, this paradoxical perspective that he paints here, is that we can actually allow all that and still make a case that Christmas is, even if it is an evolution, it's the right kind of evolution. It's the evolution that saves what the pagans maybe would have squandered, left to themselves. So
beautiful. Yes.
All right. Well, anything final to add before we wrap up for this episode?
I'm just really sorry for that Irishman. As soon as you said you got into an argument with him, I was thinking, oh, that poor guy. But more than that, I mean, it's just sorry that try to remember, if you get into an argument with friends or even family this holiday season, try to remember the person and how much sadder their life is if they're trying to exercise Christmas and Christ from it, and keep that compassion, keep that joy, because that's what's going to draw them in. It's not going to be your brilliant arguments, although that might help. It's going to be the truth and the reality of the Christian faith.
Yes, indeed. And it's one of the traps that we can so easily fall into, because we want so much to defend the faith. But we speak about the war on Christmas in a certain way. Well, not to deny that that's there, not to deny that's present, but in a certain sense, war takes two parties, right? And I think we would do better to, if Christmas is to be besieged, Christmas will survive. Chesterton, again, in lots of writings, points out that Christmas has always been under attack. It's always been thought to be dying, just like Christianity has been thought to be dying. As he says in The Everlasting Man, there are at least 5 times in history where Christianity has, for all intents and purposes, gone to the dogs. In each case, it was the dog that died. So... let's try to avoid arguing about it. Try to just take the joy of the season and manifest it, and go around with that silly smile on our face. And I think
wear a silly hat, and
that's right.
spread the joy.
That's right. All right. Well, thank you, Grettelyn, for a great conversation.
Thank you, Joe.
And thank you, viewers and listeners. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. Hopefully it gave you a little bit to think about. As I said, check out the show notes for this one. There's going to be a bunch of links to some resources that you can study up on, and have those refutations of some of these canards that get trotted out this time of year ready at hand. But you'll also have this great essay by Chesterton that makes the point that even if none of those arguments work, doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter for the ultimate truth of the thing. And please do tune in next week for another of this series of Advent podcasts. We're very, very grateful for you joining us through this Advent. It's not too late, by the way, to sign up for Advent Reflections at our website. Even if you haven't been doing our daily reflections, you can do so by going to chesterton.org/Advent. And in the meantime, as we now start to get later into this season and closer to Christmas and prepare for it, please do pray for us as we will pray for you. And hopefully we will be able to celebrate this Christmas together virtually as well, because as we know, Chesterton is always better with friends, and Christmas is, of course, better with friends. Till next time, God bless.